Hello and welcome to this module where we are going to be discussing the attributes and classification of stock items. Stores and bin locations and stock accounts, they define where and how stock items are kept. However, for each stock item, we need to define a number of attributes which govern how that item is procured, how it is stored, and how it is used. So in other words, our system needs to be flexible and customizable for each single item so that we can specify how that item is bought, how it is stored, and how it is used. We are going to be discussing some of the typical attributes of stock items. You should note that it is not an exhaustive list. It is not conclusive because there are many other attributes that define different items depending on their technical specifications. So the extent to which a computerized inventory system is suitable depends on its ability to capture all the attributes for the stock items that you handle in your organization. This is particularly important where the stock items have a number of technical specifications that are employed in the day-to-day handling of the items. I always give an example of my first employer. They had this huge manufacturing system which had a stock control module. We won a tender to supply this stock module to the cotton company or cotton marketing board for our country. But after winning the tender and we're trying to implement the system, we discovered that the stock system that we had did not exactly match the items that were going to be handled. The problem came in the documentation that was supplied by the consultants who helped the cotton company to go out to tender. They simply put standard definitions of stock items. They did not consider the specific definitions of stock items in the cotton industry. So here we were with a system that was very suitable in a production environment, very suitable in an office environment, in a workshop environment, but now it had to keep items like cotton strands. So for the cotton strand, it had probably 10 or more extra attributes that described it, which did not exist in the standard system that we had. Because for the strand of cotton, they wanted to measure how long that strand is, what is its diameter, what is its moisture content, what is the elasticity of that item. So whenever one of those attributes changed, the part number also changed. So at the end of the day, that system could not be used because it wasn't able to capture all the attributes for the stock items. So that is why it is so important for us to discuss these stock attributes so that you are able to define properly what kind of system you need to handle the particular type of stock items that you maintain. Every stock item needs an item code or a part number. Some people will call it a bin number. This is a unique code or a number which identifies the item that is to be made, that is to be stocked, or that is to be used. Further, you need a description, which is a more descriptive name for the stock account. Whereas the item code and part number could be a number or a combination of numbers and letters. The description tells you exactly what the item is. So it could tell you that this is a 20 millimeter PVC pipe for electrical conduit, or it could tell you that this item is a prepaid water meter, and so forth. Then for that item you need a unit of measure. So these are the units in which the item is handled. It is possible for you to define different units for the different stages, especially for liquid items, which for example you can order in a drum of 50 liters, but you store it in 5-liter containers, and probably when you issue, the people only need 1 liter or half a liter at a time. So in that case, you have got a unit of measure for purchasing. You also have a price unit of measure. In other words, are they charging per drum, are they charging per liter, and so forth. You also have a storage unit of measure. When we keep it in stores, do we keep it as a whole pack of 50 tissue papers, or do we unpack it and pack the individual tissue rolls now as single items? So that is your storage unit. Then you also have a unit of issue. When people come asking for that item, do you give them individual items, or is there a restriction to say you can only get a pack of 6 at a time? Further, we look at the product group. So the product group is a user-defined code for classifying your products into groups. For example, you can say we have got hair products and pesticides. You can probably say we have got a group for chemicals, a group for electrical items, and so forth. The extent to which you subdivide is determined by the level of detail that you need when you are reporting. So the more subdivisions you have, the more work you are also going to have in maintaining this stock. That is why many people end up just having a few product groups, because they do not want to be bothered. Under electrical items, do I subdivide it into plugs, plug sockets, light bulbs, wiring, and so forth? So the more details that you put in your product groups, the more work there is also in compiling your reports and classifications. There is also another attribute that we call a component class. So this one is useful especially in manufacturing and maintenance environments, where we use bill of materials or bill of quantities. So for a product that is having a combination or a recipe of how the item is made, you will discover that the item that is on top, the final product, is called an end product or an end item. Then you've got another level in the middle of what we call sub-assemblies. So now these are half finished assemblies that are joined together to make the final product. Then at the very bottom you have the components and the raw materials. So when you have got an item in stock, you need to be able to say, is it a component, is it a sub-assembly of another product, or is it an end product on its own? We also specify different type codes, and the type code could define whether this is a normal manufactured item, is it a reference item, maybe such as a technical drawing, it could be a map, it could be a circuit diagram, it could be a plan for a building. So reference items are those items that people come to stores to borrow them so that they can use them for some information and they bring them back to stores. The item could also be a tool, because the stores could be keeping certain specialized tools so that when a person needs to go and cut trees in the location, they come and borrow the chainsaw from stores and then they return it when they've finished what they're doing. An item could also be a byproduct of the manufacturing process, but because it is useful, you take that byproduct and you put it into your stores, because either it is going to be sold or it is going to be issued internally for consumption. So that is the purpose of the item type code. You could also have a drawing number. So this is specific especially to the drawings and maps that we were referring to. So you can record its specific reference number. Stock items can also be traced. So you need to record the type of traceability. We call this the trace code. So the trace code determines the type of traceability. So when we talk of traceability, we are saying, is it possible to identify this individual item from the time you received it from the supplier, and then when you are issuing it, you can say this is that specific item which came that day. There are certain items where the trace code could be N or no. In other words, the item is not serialized. It doesn't have any individual mark to identify it. So if we received, for example, a lot of nuts and bolts, there is no serial number that we can use to identify them. So the moment that you mix them in that box, there is no traceability whatsoever. Then you get other items that are individually serialized, which means that every instance of that item can be identified uniquely. So you are able to go into your stores and say this water meter with serial number 1234 is the one that we received on this particular day, and it was issued to this particular client. Then you also have what is called range serialization. Range serialization is used where you are manufacturing a lot of items, and when you are selling them, instead of listing the individual serial numbers for 1,000 cell phones, for example, you simply say we are giving you a batch with serial numbers from 1000 to 1099, or we are giving you a range of serial numbers from 1 to 1 million. So you don't have to list the individual items. So we call it a range serialization. Then you also have another form of traceability, which is the batch serialization. In this case, the items do not have individual serial numbers, but instead the serial number is given to the whole batch. So that normally happens where you are producing things in mass. When we are running our factory and we are making, say, our maize meal or our sugar, that particular shift will pack, say, 10,000 bags of maize meal. So we give all those 10,000 bags of maize meal a single batch number, which can be traced to that particular shift. So that is how they are able to trace items which are defective. Because when you go to a supermarket and you discover that there seems to be some poison in a baby cereal, they trace the batch number to the day, to the factory, to the time that that particular batch was made. Then they send out a message and say, bring back all the items with this particular batch number. So that is what we call batch serialization. So remember, we are still describing the different attributes of an individual stock item. So if this item is a manufactured item, we also need to specify the manufacturing facility where that item is made in your organization. Then we also specify the ordering rule. In other words, the replenishment method for this particular item. Do we use the normal ordering, maximum, minimum replenishment method? Are we using MRP? Do we use just in time? And so forth. So for each item, you can specify a different ordering method or a different ordering rule. Earlier on, I mentioned that there are different lead times in the factory. The first lead time we talked about was the time it takes to make the items when all the raw materials are available. We have got what we call composite lead time, which is the total length of the longest structure leg, including raw material procurement. So it means that this is the lead time from the time you place an order for your raw materials until the time you finish production. Then you have got what is called manufacturing lead time. So the manufacturing lead time is also the total length of the longest product structure, but excluding buffered material procurement. So in other words, we are now just looking at the manufacturing time itself without the procurement process. And what we simply call lead time would be the time in working days that is required to make this item from its components or source from suppliers. So if it is in a factory, it's just the time you need to make it if you have got all the components available. But if we are sourcing this item from suppliers, lead time would be time we need to place the order and receive that item from suppliers. For each item, you need to define what is the prime store and the prime account. So the prime store or the primary store, that is the main store where this item is usually found. So this is in a multi-store environment. Then we also define what is the prime account or the primary stock account. So this is the normal stock account for this item. So when we say normal stock account, we are not talking of transit accounts. For example, when an item is in the on order account, that is not a normal account, it's just a transit account. When an item is in the goods receiving, that is also a transit account. But we are saying, where do you usually find this item? Is it in the goods for sale account? Is it in the finished goods account? Or is it in the free goods account? For each item, we also define what we call a value class. So the value class classifies items according to the value of a single item. You can take the price of one computer, then you compare it to the price of one screw, you compare it to the price of one desk, the price of one electrical bulbs. So you now rank these items according to the value of one item. Then you probably say the top 5% or 10%, we call them high value items. The next 20%, we call them maybe middle value, and then the rest of the 70%, we call them low value items. So the reason why I've said 70% is because the biggest number of stock items are those very cheap and small items. So they contribute or constitute the greatest number of stock items, but at the same time contribute the least value to your stock. We also have what we call ABC classification, that is to do with turnover. When we're talking about the key performance indicators, the first one we mentioned was the stock turnover, and we said it is the number of times that we have to reorder and replace the items because they are being bought or because they are being used. So an item with an ABC classification of A would have the highest turnover, and as you go down the alphabet, it's getting lower and lower. So we don't usually go to Z, we just have ABC: high turnover, middle and low turnover items. In large stores, thousands of items are stocked, and it is not possible to apply the techniques of stock planning such as economic order quantity to each item. Therefore, we classify these items according to groupings, like the first 10%, next 20%, and the final 70%. If you are aware of the 80-20 rule, it says it is normal for 20% of items in stock to account for 80% of the value of purchases, and for the other 80% to only account for 20% of the total value of purchases. So that is why we only need 3 groupings or classifications, because the bulk of the value is only contained in 20% of the items. We also have other attributes for stock items. For example, we can indicate whether it's a make or buy item. So in other words, if we say it's made in, it means that this item, we don't buy it from suppliers, but we make it ourselves in-house. So in other words, this is an end product from our factory. But if we say we buy it, then that item needs a purchase order for it to be procured from suppliers. Then we also need to indicate alternatives indicators. So the alternatives indicator, it shows us whether this item has got alternatives or substitutes, because there are certain items which if you don't find it, you can use a different part number. So we specify if for that particular item there are alternatives or substitutes. Then there is store life. Your shelf life for the item must indicate how many days can this item be kept on the shelf before it spoils. Then we have got the storage type. We indicated earlier on when we are talking about bin control that each location specifies the storage type. So when you also create the single item, you specify its storage type so that it can be matched to a bin location with the same storage type. We mentioned earlier on that you can specify different units of measure for an item. Some items are bought per drum or per truckload, but when you store them, they can be stored in a different unit. When you sell them or issue them, you also can issue them in another different unit. So there's a need to be able to convert from one unit to the next. So we do this using a unit of measure conversion table, so that we can say a 6-pack is equal to 6 individual units. We say a 12-pack is equal to 12 individual units. 1 kilogram is equal to 1,000 grams. 1 liter is equal to 1,000 milliliters. So that if we have transactions in different units of measure, we can use the unit of measure conversion table to convert everything to a single unit for comparison purposes. So that table will have columns of the item code or the part number. Then you indicate from which unit you are converting and to which unit you are converting, and then the conversion factor. So in other words, you can say from kilograms to grams, the conversion factor is times 1,000. The reverse would be from grams to kilograms, the conversion factor is times 001 or divided by 1,000. So this is very critical for those people that are handling items that are bought in bulk and then issued or stored individually. An item can also be described according to the way that it is procured. That is why we need to maintain an up-to-date supplier catalog. Our supplier catalog then gives us a relationship between each item and the various suppliers that supply that item. In other words, we can actually specify how each supplier treats the different items. On our bin card, we can specify and say our preferred supplier for this item is Game Store. And we can say Game Store, their preference code is 1. And then another supplier can get a preference code of 2. Meaning if that item is not found at Game, we go to the next supplier with the next preference code. So the parameters that we can set for each item in the supplier relationship would be the supplier code itself, then the branch for the supplier where we buy the item. So if the supplier has got different branches, you indicate which branch is closest to you. Then the preference code, like we said, is giving the supplier a sequence number in terms of preference. Then we specify the supply lead time. In other words, at this particular supplier, what is the time interval in days between placing an order and receiving the goods? So if we have got 2 suppliers for one item, one supplier might have a lead time of 2 days, another supplier has a lead time of 5 days. So that is why it's important to have these supplier catalogs that match individual items to specific suppliers. We can also specify scrap percentage for the supplier. So this is the expected reject rate for this particular item. That is when it is delivered from the supplier. There are certain suppliers that you know, if they are delivering light bulbs, you can be sure to find 5 out of 100 which are broken because of the way they handle their things. Then there are other suppliers that you will know they never have any scrap because of the way they also handle the stock. Then for that supplier, we need to specify what is the agreed or the catalog price for that specific unit. And then the delivery unit of measure. This is where the item can be handled in different units of measure. Then you must also specify the supplier's part number. In other words, we want to know if this supplier has got their own unique part number for this specific item, because we have our own item code. So what is their part number, so that when we order that item, we quote their part number and there is no confusion as to which item we are trying to buy. We also need to specify the supply terms for this particular item. Is it a cash on delivery item? Is it on a 30-day, 60-day account, and so forth? Then for that supplier, we also need to keep what was the latest price that we paid for that item. So this is historical data that you must maintain. What is the last price we paid? Because many times people are confused. They don't even know how much they last paid for a particular item from that supplier. So your system must give you that facility to keep or to maintain, and then to easily retrieve the last price that you paid. And then you want to know what is the price unit of measure. So when you walk into a shop or a wholesaler, you might find they've got these cartons of lotion or dishwashing liquid. On the shelf, there is an instruction that says we only sell cartons of 12 or cartons of 6. But when you look at the price is per bottle. So they are using 1 unit for pricing, which is per bottle. Then they are using a different unit for selling, because they are selling a pack of 6 or a pack of 12. So you need to specify in your supplier catalog what is their unit of measure for pricing that specific item. When we come back to the next module, I'm now going to start taking you bit by bit into our practice system. So if you manage to get hold of this practice system, which I'm making available to everybody, then I also want you to try and go through it as well. But if you are not able to get hold of it, then you can simply follow me on the screen. All I'm doing is simply demonstrate the concepts that we've been learning so far, but I'm demonstrating how they can be implemented in an actual stock management system. But otherwise, do not hesitate to call me or send me an email so that I make sure that you have a copy of this software that I'm going to be showing you. So let's meet in the next module.